if you have, so just, sorry, give me a sip of tea. My throat is a little sore. If you have trick and complex PTSD, does that automatically mean that you're on the autism spectrum? No, it does not. Uh, Trick is one thing, PTSD is another thing. So separate entities. They might interact. PTSD can trigger or make trick worse, as you've seen, but they're separate. And autism then is also a separate issue. So they're three completely different and unrelated disorders, but they can coexist at the same time. How do autistic people experience PTSD and how can they get help? So for the first part, how they experience PTSD, the symptoms will be similar to what I described, but what specific combination of symptoms you'll have, and this really depends from person to person. There's nothing blanket that I think is fair to say that autistic people will experience, that other people won't. What they might struggle with is how to convey their experience to other people because of other issues that autism, or rather ASD, overall carries with it. But in terms of symptoms, it will be a specific combination of everything that I've listed. In terms of getting help, for PTSD, I think any decent therapist should be able to help you. There are therapists who specialize in PTSD, so that's an option. In terms of autism, I think at this day and age, therapists should be able to understand what that is. So I don't think you need to find anyone specific for this. So you can perhaps focus on a therapist that specializes in PTSD. That might be a good way to go about this. Okay, so this is in addition to the first question. I was abused severely for the first 20 years of my life because people thought I was autistic. I began plucking my eyebrows and eyelashes in 2000 and didn't have eyebrows for 10 years. But I still don't have eyelashes. I was diagnosed with complex PTSD in 2010 and I have been picking my lip since 1994. So you have skin picking and hair pulling as together as a combination. This is quite common. I believe about a third of people will have more than one BFRB. So what you're describing here, oh, sorry, there's another addition. I was also diagnosed with Tourette syndrome in 2016. Though I've had tics since 1997, I know that there's a connection between the two. I hope my input helps. Well, absolutely certain that sharing your story will help, so thank you for that. Often people, after the webinar, because people email me their impressions and they propose topics and then tell me what they like or dislike, they will often tell me that they appreciate when people share their stories. So maybe that's something that we can actually do in one of the next webinars. Perhaps we can have a kind of interactive webinar where people can, something different from the support groups that we have, but something that would incorporate this sharing aspect. So just to go back to what you wrote here, so it appears that the cause for your abuse was that people thought you were autistic, but that doesn't mean obviously that you are. And a lot of what you're experiencing, I can see how it can stem from complex PTSD, or let's say be a part of it. I find that hair pulling helps me with my PTSD because it causes a jolt of pain that helps me regulate my distress, especially since I get very angry and physically aggressive. I was not allowed to react aggressively as normal as a kid. Otherwise, I could have been beaten or killed by my violent birth father. So this is a very good example of how, how we learn or don't learn, as the case may be, emotional regulation from our immediate environment. So I completely understand that if you're not allowed to express your emotions, which is normal, kids express their emotions often in very inappropriate ways because they're kids. And by expressing them, parents can teach them healthy ways to deal with this. And when you experience abuse as a response to something that's quite normal, then I can easily see how hair pulling could be a way to regulate distress. So effectively, you have evolved your own emotional regulation strategy. Maybe not the healthiest one, but that means that you have found a way to take care of yourself, which in itself is a huge achievement. Hi, my name. Okay, so I won't read the name. I'm 16 years old. I have been struggling with hair pulling disorder and I go to therapy, but I don't see any improvements. Please, if you can help, I will be so thankful. If you can, I would gladly tell you how everything started. Just please help me. Um, okay, so you have my email down here. So if you want advice, you can email me and I will offer you advice to the best of my abilities. Um, it might, if, so I don't know where you're from, obviously, but what you can do is if you feel like your therapist doesn't know how to deal with hair pulling, you can actually give my email to your therapist and your therapist can consult with me. I'm always happy to help colleagues as much as I can, so I can give them a few tips on how to help you. So that's consider that one as well. Because it's I can give you advice over email, but advice doesn't equal therapy, and advice is easy to get, but not easy to apply. But maybe if I speak or correspond with your therapist, I could actually be more useful. English is not my first language, so I apologize in advance. There's really no need to apologize for that. I have grown up in a comfortable, financially stable home. I think one thing is missing is just emotional availability. In my teenage years, I used to cut my hand. I look that phase, teenage angst phase now personally. Then I started pulling hair off my eyebrows. Initially, I looked at it just as a habit that would go away eventually. However, after 6 years, I still do it, and during pandemic lockdown, I started getting emotionally numb, and now I just don't care. I feel guilty because I'm privileged enough to get things which most people don't get to get for their whole life. At least I really appreciate all of your efforts towards this cause. Oh, at last, sorry. This is not your English, this is me being blind. Um, I have to kind of enter the screen to be able to read these small letters. So there's one thing that I would like to point out here. First of all, thank you for sharing your story. So that is helpful. Also, if for all of you who've written, like there are quite a few stories that I've read, I think so far. We have support groups both for people who are in the program, but we also have free support groups for people from anywhere who just want to join. So keep a look out for our monthly newsletter because there you will see where and how to sign up for the support groups. So it's like a good place where you can come and then hear other people's stories, share your own, ask for advice. I think asking me for advice is one thing, and I'm willing to give it, as you can see. But I think getting advice from people who struggle with the same issue could be a whole other way of getting help and feeling seen. So, by all means, join one of our support groups and then share your story. The second thing that I wanted to say, uh, well, there are three things now that I'm rereading your comment. So, the second thing is about being emotionally numb. So, dissociating from your emotions and hair pulling are similar. They are different defense mechanisms, but they both serve the same purpose, which is to distance you from your intense emotions. And the third thing that I wanted to say is that being privileged has nothing to do with having mental health struggles. When you phrase things this way, and I hear this very often from very well-meaning and nice people, but I feel like the only thing that happens is that you just end up feeling guilty, and then when you feel guilty, then you get even more triggered to pull. So feeling guilty for being privileged doesn't really help. And psychological issues, or I don't know, general health issues, largely don't care for privilege. Hair pulling doesn't really care if you're privileged or not. You simply have it. So if I were you, I would kind of try to divorce these two things. Having privilege means that you can use it constructively to help other people, to elevate them to where you are so that they can all have the same privileges. But just feeling guilty in itself isn't very productive. politically it's not very productive, socially it's not very productive, and most certainly in terms of your pulling it's not very productive, because what you end up with is even more negative emotions that you have to deal with somehow. And if numbing out and pulling are your mechanisms, what do you think will happen? So I think one place to start is to actually learn to be nice to yourself, because if you're pulling, you're suffering. If you're suffering, you deserve compassion. Privilege, no privilege, you deserve compassion just because you're suffering. That's at least how I look at it. Internal 911, 911 is a very appropriate and accurate description of trauma. Yeah, I, I think, like, by all accounts that I've heard over the years, to me that is the is an adequate, maybe not the best possible, but an adequate description of what trauma feels like. Because I remember 9/11 and how surreal it seemed. It literally seemed like it is not reality as it was happening. And that's exactly what trauma is. It's something that completely bursts our reality bubble for a moment. There's a very interesting and sometimes controversial philosopher from Slovenia, Slavoj Žižek, who talked about 9/11 as being a kind of explosion of the symbolic order in which people lived. Because regardless of where you live, that event seemed so unbelievable, because the world that we lived in was a much safer world. And then when people started thinking, well, if this can happen in, the most powerful country in the world when it comes to military and security, I mean, nothing's off the table. So in a sense, it really did kind of destroy a part of how all of us saw reality. And that's exactly what happens internally when we experience trauma. Because think about, someone wrote here about physical abuse uh, at a very young age. When you're very little, the only thing that you know about your parents is that they seem like these big, important figures that are supposed to protect you because you can't take care of yourself. You literally need your parents to live. And then suddenly, the very person that is supposed to keep you alive and protected turns against you. How does that not destroy your entire view of reality, or at least a large part of it? So, yeah. Um, as for substance abuse and avoidance, food is another way to numb the pain. I'm speaking from personal experience. Yeah, absolutely. As I said, food is a very the trouble with food. I mean, when it comes to hair pulling, the reason why there's a lot of shame and stigma around it is because it is not something that's socially acceptable. But when it comes to food, I feel like uh, people are obviously shamed for being overweight, but in a very strange way, even through humor or TV shows, um, eating our way through emotions is not as frowned upon. So you don't have this stigma around it. So I think a lot of people wouldn't say that they have issues processing emotions, but they will use food to mask or cover up, their emotions. They won't even know it, because it's not something that one would consider a symptom in itself. Whereas for hair pulling, it's kind of quote unquote obvious as a symptom. And one of the reasons why I'm mentioning it is obviously this comment, but then also because if there's one avoidant behavior that you're employing, chances are there are others as well. So I had a client in Trickstop who did the program and kept emphasizing from time to time how much she appreciates that the program is anonymous and that she doesn't have to go anywhere, because you can just open your laptop and write about your issues and learn and do stuff. And then it turns out that one thing that she had, but she kind of accidentally left out, is that she has agoraphobia. So she doesn't actually leave her apartment all that much. Agoraphobia is obviously not just an issue with avoidance, but you can see how never leaving your house will reduce or eliminate a lot of very unpleasant situations in our lives. So that in itself is, for example, also an avoidant behavior. just emphasize also, because I don't want to kind of reduce or banalize any of these conditions. What are your thoughts on hair loss as being the source of trauma itself? I feel like I identify with so many of the hyperarousal and avoidance symptoms, but that all roads lead back to the insecurity or trauma around hair loss itself for me, which then kicks off a vicious cycle. Absolutely. In the beginning of the webinar, I had that one slide where I talked about what trauma is, and there is no like there's even a list somewhere where I don't know, some researcher ranked like what's more traumatic and what's less traumatic, and I absolutely detest lists like this because really hair loss can be an incredible trauma for someone. For someone else, it could be nothing. So in that sense, if you find yourself in these symptoms, obviously just by listening to my webinar, you can't diagnose yourself, but it can serve as a jumping off point for more detailed research. If you feel like that's traumatic for you, then no one should really oppose that. That's your experience, and that's what it is. There's another thing, though, that I would like to add here is that trauma can actually lead to hair loss. Stress can lead to hair loss. There, in dermatology, there's a specific type of diffuse hair loss that actually follows a stressful event. But it doesn't follow it immediately. It follows it like a couple of months afterwards. I'm not a dermatologist, so I don't know what the average times are. This is just me going back to my medical school memories. But you can actually experience intense hair loss as a response to trauma. Seeing Trick as a gift helps me put into a different perspective. Thank you. Well, you're welcome. I think this is quite a tricky topic, and I can imagine that someone might feel a lot of resistance to seeing Trick as being a gift or having anything positive about it. But in my opinion and in my experience as a therapist, acknowledging this maybe not, it's maybe far-fetched to say good side to a symptom, but the useful side to a symptom is really very important. Because if let's say that Trick serves as a way to regulate emotions, that is its job. It's a necessary thing. We all need to regulate our emotions. It's just something that living in society, even living with ourselves, requires of us. So there's nothing wrong with the function it performs. The thing is that the cost is too high. But in order to find a healthier way to satisfy this very normal need, you really need to acknowledge it. And getting to that point where you can see Trick in a way as a gift means that you're really making progress towards accepting it and then obviously dealing with it as well. I've read that some people may have trichotillomania and Tourette's. Is that true? Yes, it is true. It's not the most common thing that co-occurs with Trick, but yes, it does happen. People, in addition to hair pulling, the most common thing that people have is some other body-focused repetitive behavior, like, for example, skin picking or cheek biting, one of these things. Then conditions like generalized anxiety or OCD or borderline personality disorder, trauma also, and Tourette's most certainly. Sometimes I pull because I hate pulling, and when I pull, I start hating myself, and then I start thinking bad thoughts because of that, and I pull even more. It's a never-ending cycle. How do I stop? Well, two things parallel to each other. One, self-compassion, because if you get upset at yourself, self-compassion is a very good way to cut through that, so to end the cycle on that level. And then the second thing would be to implement some practical strategies to stop pulling. So something that would fall under the scope of habit reversal training, for example. We had a whole webinar or even two on that, so you can go and look it up on our website and learn more about how to implement it. I think a couple of months ago, because after a while, all these webinars, I forget which one came after and which one came first, but we had, I think, one webinar about habits, We had one about habit reversal training, and then we had one about how to actually apply habit reversal training in everyday life. So there's at least 3 other webinars that you can use to start kind of working for yourself if you're not ready to start seeing a therapist or you don't want to. I start pulling without PTSD, as most people do also, I have to say. And as I got older, I experienced events where it just hit. Could that have affected my pulling worse? Do you mean that at some point you've experienced traumatic events and that made your pulling worse? Because that is absolutely a plausible scenario. Is it possible to have PTSD if a person has not been in a war or combat? Yeah, of course. I would say that most PTSD is not due to combat. People can experience bullying, violence, all kinds of abuse. Someone mentioned that losing their hair was traumatic. I've seen people who've experienced severe reactions to things like aging, which is about as natural as anything can possibly be. So, yes, what constitutes trauma is very much individual. It depends on your lived experiences, it depends on your expectations, on how you see yourself, on the kinds of emotional regulation skills you have, and so on. So there are many factors that will determine what trauma will be for you. Sorry, let me just go downward a little bit. It is already a problem for 3 years. What tips or treatments that I can use? So I don't know what you've tried in the past 3 years or so, but if you're looking to deal with the habitual aspect of pulling, then the largest evidence base exists for habit reversal training. But in general, according to studies that we have, any form of CBT will be effective. Just different kinds of talk therapy will have different approaches. The question is just what works best for you. Would you prefer something practical, something that deals more with emotions, or something that, I don't know, examines your past, or depending on your approach. There are no FDA approved drugs specifically for hair pulling, although if you see a psychiatrist, you might be prescribed with an SSRI. Few studies that we have say that psychotherapy, however, overall is the most effective treatment. Is combing through your hair trying to get the hair out but not actually pulling? Is that hair pulling? That depends on, so on the face of it, you can say that it isn't, but if you use this to regulate your emotions, and if it leads to hair loss, if it leads to some kind of impaired functioning in everyday life, you can make the case that it is a problem. However, I've had clients who use this strategy that you're just saying to actually stop pulling. People would find those brushes with very long spikes and then brush their hair because that would stimulate the scalp. So for people for whom this sensory component is important, this can actually be a way to stop pulling. And then also keep in mind that sometimes people will consider a certain amount of pulling to be normal grooming. So in that sense, there is no clear boundary. It's a matter of what's acceptable to you specifically. Can you touch a bit on emotions and how to recognize them before a pulling session may start? Can I touch a bit? We can have a webinar on this. In fact, we may have had one. So I mentioned briefly that I like to ask people to focus on their bodies, and this is because identifying emotions for a lot of people who struggle with hair pulling, BFRBs, I think across the board, but hair pulling specifically, in my experience, maybe not everyone's experience, but clinically, it's what I see, is that people who struggle with hair pulling have a particular difficulty identifying emotions. Usually, when I tell them to use our self-monitoring app for the first few weeks in the program, so that we can learn, about different patterns that have to do with hair pulling, there's one part of the app that asks you to list the emotions that you're experiencing before, during, and after. And then what I usually get is something like discomfort or difficulty or anxiety, which doesn't necessarily even mean anxiety, just means anything negative. So that's the kind of answer that I get. The next thing that I tell people is that, first of all, that's not very informative because the chair that I'm sitting on right now isn't very comfortable because I broke off something today and it keeps moving back and forth. But I wouldn't really call that discomfort an emotion at all. And most certainly, I wouldn't call it an intense negative emotion, although it does give me quite a lot of negative sensations since I feel like I'm on a boat and I have to put extra effort to balance myself. So, not every discomfort is relevant, and not every discomfort will constitute a triggering emotion. So, I will tell people to specifically focus on their bodies, and because this is again vague for some people, I will give specific instructions: shoulders, chest, abdomen. This is not for 100% of the people, but for 95% for sure it is. We tend to store a lot of our stress in our shoulders, and this is where you can identify chronic emotions. Like if you're anxious all the time, or tense, or scared a lot of the times, if you don't feel safe, chances are this will be tense, or muscles that are just between your shoulder blades. They also tend to tense up. Then, if you're anxious, you can pay attention to your chest because your breathing will change. When we are acutely anxious, we will breathe very quickly and in a shallow way. But then, if anxiety is present for a long time, our breathing might be normal, but then it might be shallow. And then from time to time, we might feel like we don't have enough air, and then we have to inhale very deeply. Some people might feel something strange in their stomach. And if you think about it, sometimes we know that we like someone because we feel butterflies in our stomach. So, abdomen, chest, shoulders, and then that area between your shoulder blades. Those would be good places to start identifying sensations. You start by noticing what you feel. You don't have to define it, you don't have to have a precise term to explain it. All you have to do is notice what's happening and then write it down somewhere. Write down what sensations you felt, write down any thoughts that you might recall, and then write down where you were and what you were doing. So what situation you were in. And then when you put all these together, you might be able to define an emotion. Recognizing emotions is not something that we're born with. It's really a skill that can be learned. Usually we pick it up as we grow up from our parents, from I don't know, TV shows or wherever. But it's something that you can consciously learn as an adult. Keep a log, and then from time to time review it, like once a week, once a month, depending on how much information you put. And then try to connect the setting, the thought, and the emotion. I can give you some general recipes, even though I don't like recipes, but guilt, for example, is often an indication that you've done something that goes against your values. Anxiety is often your body telling you that you can't make sense of a certain situation. Sadness is an indication of loss. Right? Threat means that something about how you see yourself will have to change very radically. Being angry can mean that either you're helpless or that you're about to start bullying reality into conforming with your expectations. So it indicates that you have some ideas about your current situation that aren't exactly working. So that would be one way to think about emotions. And you can come up with your own theory by just creating these logs and following the patterns. This is about as brief and concise as I could be because this is a huge topic. I had extreme pulling urges because of trauma nightmares. I tried coping by painting or other physical or practical things. It helped for the moment being, but the second I stopped and was going to bed, I started pulling and couldn't stop myself, and it led to suicidal thoughts. In my case, trichotillomania is worse than my complex PTSD because it reminds me of how sick I am and all the sick things people did to me. How do I best cope in these situations? I will give you an answer that you won't like, but it is a useful answer in the long run. I understand that these intense moments are what you want to deal with. But when you have urges that are so intense that they actually lead to suicidal thoughts, it might be a good idea to actually focus on reducing the urges from becoming so intense. If you have nightmares, for example, when you wake up, sit down and write them down. Writing down difficult thoughts, also writing down nightmares, is first a treasure trove of information for therapy. And second of all, it gives you a little bit of distance. It kind of unglues you from the emotion. So that will give you some breathing room and it will provide a different perspective. One thing. Second thing, find ways to make yourself feel safe. It can be something as gentle as grounding, or it can be something more intense, like if you have a partner, wake them up. That's their job. People close to us are supposed to put up with us when we feel bad. Maybe they can find a way to make you feel safe. And then identify what is it that usually triggers you, or what is it that contributes to the overall arousal in your body, and then try to proactively deal with these things. Because what you're describing here has the similar intensity that picking trances have. And picking trances are best prevented than stopped. So this would be my advice here. Just be proactive. Follow what the triggers are, what the contributing factors are, the risk factors, I guess we can say, and then find ways to minimize them or avoid them. In these situations, acting in advance might be the best thing you can do for yourself. And then if you have CPTSD, finding therapy for that, needless to say, is important. I like the idea of sharing stories. Often it provides affirmation for one's own experiences. Yeah, I think this is one thing, since we started support groups in last year, this is one thing that I hear every week, is that people sometimes just like hearing a story. Even if someone doesn't have a solution, it really helps a lot to say it out loud. It helps to hear that someone's going through the same thing. And it makes you feel a little less like an outcast, because you know that there are people who share your experience. So yeah, I'll see if I can come up with a way to build that into the webinars, or at least in one webinar to start with, and then we can see if it works. In the meantime, sign up for the support groups. Sorry, I'm just trying to see. There are some compliments and things, and I feel weird reading them out loud because it sounds like I'm praising myself. But thank you to all of you who've sent these kind of words. How does what you say about PTSD and trauma apply to, scroll that. Okay, so how does what you said about PTSD and trauma apply to repressed memories of traumatic events that were recently remembered? It applies absolutely in the same way. Actually, I believe I did mention that trauma is often related to issues with memory, because it's a defense mechanism for a lot of people. So everything that goes about the connection between PTSD and trick works here as well, except that you can add one more thing, which is that even if you don't remember repressed, well, obviously you don't remember the repressed, you don't remember them, but they still carry certain weight. When we repress something, what we actually do is that we remove this from our consciousness. But that doesn't mean that the repressed content isn't active and that it doesn't do something. It just means that we have no awareness of it. People are anxious sometimes because of how much they repress. When Freud formulated his theory of repression, because it's very fashionable these days to hate Freud, even though all of us use literally the language that Freud invented and his concepts. So I think it's sometimes worth going back to the source. I don't agree with some of his theories, but what he wrote about repression in one place, I forgot where that was. Maybe I don't remember, so I don't want to make stuff up now. But he said that repression is very effective because it can make entire parts of our life and our experience just disappear. Poof, doesn't exist anymore. But at the same time, the cost of suppression is a lot of wasted energy. Because the way that Freud thinks about repression and the way that we still think about repression is not that You repress something, and then it's this in this kind of repository of repressed things where it's just, I don't know, chilling. It's very active and emotionally charged. So the way that to think about repression is that, um, let me see. So there's a door there in the back, if you see when I move my camera. So imagine that I put a person in there and they want to get out, and I want to keep them in. So if I want to have this webinar and have a prisoner back there, which is, I swear I don't, I have to hold my hand to block the door. Otherwise, they will run out. And the same thing applies to our repressed memories. To keep something repressed, you have to invest a lot of energy in it, and not once, but all the time. So repression produces that arousal because you're always doing something which is keeping the repressed content repressed. Too much repression leads to extreme exhaustion. And of course, then pulling serves as a kind of reinforcement of that. So you cannot remember the event and still be triggered, or rather have consequences of it, because repression itself takes a toll. And then once you remember it, you will experience some of the symptoms, perhaps, of PTSD. So you might also be tempted to pull as a way to regulate your emotions. I hope that was not too convoluted, because in my mind, it's simplicity itself. How do you join support groups? Um, I believe that the two that are left for this month are booked up, but subscribe to our newsletter, and then they will send you, because we send all the information, like for support groups, webinars, programs, stuff that we offer, everything through the newsletter. So in the beginning of the month or at the end of every month, I'm not quite sure, they will send you uh, a link where to sign up, and they will send you times when support groups take place. They're all on Mondays, because I'm the one who facilitates support groups, at least for now. So I can tell you they're all on Mondays. It's just the time slots might vary a little bit. They're usually, you know, early afternoon Eastern Standard Time. Do I have to pay for TrickStop to get the free support group, or where can I find it? So we have two types of support groups. There are free support groups. They're accessible to everyone. I don't know if you've noticed, if you've been to any of the other webinars, but I strongly believe that healthcare should be accessible to everyone. So even though this is and this is a value that the owners of the company also share. So whatever we come up with for paying clients, in some way, shape, or form, we try to give out for those who cannot afford the program as well. So we have two types of support groups. So we have the public ones, and then we also have support groups that are exclusive to people who are in the program. There is also a bit of a difference. Like, there are groups where you can share anything you like, so there's no limitation to what you can talk about, as long as you are respectful. You can say anything you like. The difference is that the support groups for people in the program tend to be a little more focused on the issues that the program addresses as well, because people support each other, help each other solve problems, overcome resistance. It really helps them kind of benefit more from the program. Whereas the public support groups have more transitory memberships, like people will come once and then not again, or just come again in a couple of weeks. Whereas the ones for members, people tend to come regularly or semi-regularly. So that's the difference, but you have free ones as well. So you don't have to pay for the program. Just, I have to edit myself, really. I have my weekly addiction group now. I would like to thank you for your compassion. You're welcome, and I guess it's not terribly distasteful if I have a good time, but I hope your addiction group's productive this evening. One of the doctors said the trick is not curable and not to work on it at all. Is that true? No, that's the simple answer. I don't know why anyone would tell you not to work on something that you consider a problem. I mean, would someone say, I don't know, like, I want to learn a language? Would someone say, don't bother, you'll never be a native speaker? It's ridiculous. Whatever you think is a problem, you should be able to work on it. And second of all, it's not accurate to say the trick is not curable. I mean, hypertension is technically speaking not curable. Should we just give up on taking medication and eating healthy and exercising? I mean, I disagree with your doctor, and I disagree very strongly. I want to know what is the best way to deal with it from your side. Well, I'm a therapist, so my answer is going to be obvious: psychotherapy. My answer also is currently backed up by the data that we have. Studies show that therapy is more effective than any other form of treatment, but I don't think psychotherapy is necessarily the answer for everyone. Actually, in our support groups, people were sharing some new age strategies recently that I've never heard of, that have helped them immensely. People have tried supplements that have helped them. People have used meditation, although meditation is kind of a psychological thing too, but they've even used their religion to help them stop pulling. So there's a lot of things that you can do outside of therapy, but according to studies that we have, in my opinion, therapy is the most efficient one. How can I watch your previous webinars? You can, well, let me check the link exactly and I will tell you right away. 1 second. If you go to trickstop.com, there should be a link. 1 second. And I will tell you right away where to go. So go to trickstop.com and then, actually, I have no idea where they shoved this link. There is a page where they put all the webinars, but I don't see it on the main page. Anyways, you can go to YouTube and find our channel, and you can have all the webinars there. We upload them in two parts. One part is the Q&A, and then the first part is the webinar. The reason why we separate this is that sometimes after the webinar, people will email them and ask me not to post the Q&A because sometimes they will share something and then change their minds. So we separate them, and also no one wants to watch it to our file. So yeah, YouTube is where you want to go. Let me just see. There are some questions that I think I've already answered in some form. Do you have any previously recorded webinars focusing on trick and ADHD and or OCD? No, that's not a topic that we've addressed. Just 1 second. Let me get a piece of paper. I will write it down, and then next month I will put it up for votes, and then maybe we can have a webinar for this. So ADHD and OCD. I will put it in the next month. Be sure to join live and then vote. Maybe one of these win out. I think they're very good topics, especially ADHD and trick, because there's almost no literature at all on the topic. So a webinar would be helpful. What does psychotherapy mean? So it's in a kind of talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, psychodynamic therapy, constructivist therapy, gestalt therapy. There are many types of talk therapy. Basically, it's healing psychological issues using different kinds of conversational methods. Usually you have practical assignments to do as well. In our case of TrickStop, we do therapy in writing, but you can also have therapy. In person. My email, someone asks, is here in the lower left corner. Okay, so I think this would be a good time to stop because my sore throat has turned into actual pain. I see that there are some questions that I didn't get to answer, actually quite a few of them. If you feel like I didn't address everything you want to know completely, you have my email and you have the email of our support team. So please email me. And if I don't answer within a week, just email me again and remind me, just give me a nudge. It's not that I'm ignoring you on purpose. It's just that after the webinars, I usually get quite a number of emails, and then sometimes some get lost. It's not intentional. You can also ask questions about anything psychological to our support team because a psychologist will answer you there. So they can also answer those questions. I've seen quite a number of questions here that dealt with TrickStop, the program, and payments and insurance and all these things. We will have another short webinar this month, in about 2 weeks, like the last week of the month, where I will talk for about 15 minutes, just a short webinar only about TrickStop. So that's a promotional webinar. We separated these so that we don't turn this into advertisement for TrickStop, because this is not meant to be that. So I skipped most of the questions about the program. If you want to know about those like specific details, sign up for the other webinar or just email the questions. Thank you all so much, and I will see you in March, and have a pleasant evening.